A 10-year-old boy was sleeping under a broken piece of plastic on a construction site. Not because he chose to sleep there, because it was the only place in the city where nobody moved him on. The shelters had rules about age and documentation, and a boy with no birth certificate and no guardian and no last name anyone could prove fell outside most of those rules. He had been sleeping outside for 8 months. His name was Leo. The people in the neighborhood called him the Ghost Boy, not because he was mysterious or frightening, but because people had gotten so used to stepping around him, walking past him, not seeing him, that he had become the kind of presence that registered as furniture rather than as a child. On a night in January, Leo heard something. It came from under a pile of collapsed construction material, heavy wooden boards and loose soil from a section of the site that had given way earlier in the day. A sound that was not the wind and not an animal, a human sound, very faint. He went toward it. What he found under those boards changed both of their lives in ways that neither of them could have predicted, because the change was not as simple as a rescue and a reward. The man Leo pulled from under those boards was someone who had his own history, his own failures, his own family of wolves waiting for him to disappear. And bringing this man back into the world brought all of that into Leo's life too. The man had a nephew named Julian, who had been waiting 7 years for an inheritance. And Julian was not going to let a homeless child take what he believed was his. This story has a rescue in it. It has love and warmth and a boy who goes from the street to a mansion, but it also has a betrayal that comes from inside the house. It has a night when Leo had to choose between his own safety and the life of the man who had given him everything. And it has an ending that the whole city watched, and that nobody in that audience was fully prepared for. We start tonight, we start in the cold. Like this video, because this story is about someone who had nothing and gave everything anyway. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. We are here every week. Hit that bell. Comment below, what would you have done if you were Leo that night on the construction site? Leo's full name, as far as anyone knew, was Leonardo Adolfo. The Adolfo was the surname of the woman who had found him on the doorstep of the Osai Street mission when he was 3 days old. She was not his mother, she was just the woman who found him. She had given him to the mission, and she had given them her surname, and she had gone back to her own life, and that was the end of the connection. The mission had raised him until he was 6. At 6, the mission had been closed by a funding gap that the organization's accounts could not bridge. The children had been redistributed, most of them to a government facility 40 kilometers away. Leo had been among the group scheduled for transfer. He had not made it onto the transport because the transport had been disorganized, and he had been a quiet child who waited in corners, and who did not make noise when he was confused, which meant that in the chaos of the transfer morning, he had been missed. He had waited at the mission until it was dark. Then he had started walking. He was 6 years old. He walked in the direction of the city because the city was the direction that adults walked when they had somewhere to go. He had no destination. He was following a general principle. He arrived in Tema, the city, the port city with its specific combination of commercial activity and the poverty that existed in its shadow after 3 days. He had eaten things he found on the road. He had slept under bridges and in bus shelters. He had arrived. The city was not welcoming. This was not a surprise. Cities were not designed to be welcoming to 6-year-old children with no adults and no money. The city was organized around transactions, and Leo had nothing to transact with. He survived through the specific combination of methods available to a small child with intelligence and no other resources. He ran errands for market traders. He carried bags. He washed cars at the traffic stops when he was old enough and large enough to be useful at it. He found food in the ways that required him to be fast and to not think about the word stealing in a way that made him feel worse than he already felt, which was a moral calculation he performed and performed again over many years, and which he eventually resolved by telling himself, "I am not stealing food, I am alive, and alive people eat." He slept where he could. He was 10 when the construction site became his primary sleeping location. Not ideal, it was a building site in the middle of development, which meant there were workers during the day and absence at night. And the absence at night meant nobody was moving him on. He had found a section near the back wall where the ground was dry and where he could prop a piece of plastic against a half-built pillar and create something that approximated shelter. January in Tema was cold. Not cold in the way of countries with winters, cold in the way of a coastal city in the Harmattan season, where the dry wind came off the land at night, and where the absence of sun made the temperature drop enough to matter when you had no blanket and no wall. Leo was under his plastic sheet on a January Tuesday when the section of the site to his left, the section he had been avoiding for 2 days because it looked unstable, gave way. Not in the dramatic way of a complete collapse, in the specific way of construction failures, which was a gradual settling that happened faster than it should, followed by a cracking sound, followed by a significant portion of the wooden formwork, and the earth behind it coming down at once. Leo scrambled to the back wall. The section came down 20 meters from where he had been sleeping. He sat against the wall and he listened to the settling, dust and debris, the specific quiet that came after a structural event. And then a sound. Thump thump. Something rhythmic under the debris, not random, a rhythm that had intention in it. He went toward it. He moved toward the debris pile with the specific caution of someone who knew that construction sites were dangerous, and who also knew that the sound under the debris was a person. He started moving boards. The boards were heavy, adult weight heavy, the kind of timber that was used for formwork on a significant structure. He moved them the way a 10-year-old moved things that were too heavy for a 10-year-old, by not stopping to calculate whether they were too heavy, by applying everything he had to each board, by finding leverage in whatever was available. His hands bled. He did not think about his hands. He moved 8 boards before he saw the face. It was an old man, 60-something, gray-haired, in a suit that was now entirely covered in dust and soil. His face was visible. He was alive. His eyes were open and his mouth was moving, and he was trying to say something, but the weight of what was above him was limiting his breathing to shallow enough that speech was barely possible. Leo looked at him. He said, "I see you. I'm going to get you out, don't move." The old man's eyes focused on Leo. He said, barely audible, "I can't wait." "I know," Leo said, "give me a minute." He surveyed the pile. He had been doing things that required improvised solutions for 4 years. He had learned to look at a problem and find what was already present rather than waiting for the thing that was not there. There was a metal pipe, a section of reinforcement rod leaning against the adjacent pillar. He took it. He understood the principle of leverage from watching road repair workers pry out cobblestones. He positioned the rod under the heaviest board above the man's chest, and he leaned on it. The board moved. 1 centimeter, 2. He repositioned. He leaned again. The board moved further. The old man's breathing changed, became less shallow, became actual breathing. Leo worked for 20 minutes. He removed what he could. He lifted what he could. At the end of 20 minutes, the man was able to move, not freely, not without help, but able to move enough to help with the final extraction. Leo got behind him and he pulled. He pulled with the arms of a 10-year-old who had been carrying bags and washing cars for 4 years, and whose arms were, therefore, significantly stronger than they looked. The man came free. They both fell backward. They lay on the ground side by side for a moment, both breathing hard. The man said, "Who are you?" Leo said, "Leo, I sleep here." The man looked at him. He looked at Leo's hands bleeding from the board edges. He looked at Leo's feet, no shoes, the specific rough condition of feet that had been bare for months. He looked at Leo's clothes, the layers of things that were not originally intended to be worn together, which was the specific wardrobe strategy of someone who had no storage and wore everything they owned. He said, "You live here, on the construction site." Leo said, "It's dry most of the time." The man was quiet for a moment. He said, "My name is Charles Harrison." Leo looked at him. The name meant nothing to him. The name would have meant a great deal to most adults in Tema, but Leo was 10 and had been too occupied with the specific work of surviving to follow the city's commercial news. "You look scared," Leo said. "Nobody should die alone." Charles Harrison looked at this child. He said, "How old are you?" 10, Leo said. "Do you have family?" he said. "No," Leo said. "Come with me," he said. Leo looked at him. He had been offered many things over 4 years and had learned to read the space between what people said and what they meant. He looked at this old man in the dusty suit, and he looked at the specific quality of his face, not the quality of a con, which Leo had seen, but the quality of someone who had just looked at the full truth of his situation and was responding to it. "Where?" Leo said. "Home," Charles Harrison said. "Stay with us," because home turned out to be significantly more complicated than that word suggested. Charles Harrison's home was not what Leo had expected. Leo had not expected much. He had been offered shelter before, temporary, conditional, always requiring something in return that he was not comfortable providing. He had expected the Harrison house to be decent. He had expected it to be warm. He had not expected it to be 34 rooms on 3 levels on a compound that had a wall around it, and a guard at the gate, and a garden that was larger than the construction site where Leo had been sleeping. He sat in the car that came for them. Charles had called someone from a phone that Leo had not noticed in the chaos of the extraction, a brief call, 3 sentences, and he looked out the window as the car moved through increasingly different-looking neighborhoods. And then the gate opened and the car went through and he looked at the house. He said nothing. Charles beside him said, "It's just rooms and walls." Leo looked at him. "It's a lot of rooms," Leo said. Charles almost smiled. "My wife chose the house," he said. "She wanted enough space for a large family." He said it and then he said nothing more about it. And Leo understood from the quality of the silence that the wife was no longer present, and that this was not something that needed questions. The housekeeper, a woman named Abina in her 50s, who had been with the Harrison household for 11 years, met them at the door. She looked at Charles with the controlled alarm of someone who had been told there had been an incident and who was assessing the damage. She looked at Leo with the specific assessment of someone who had not been told about him and was doing their own rapid calculation. "He needs a room," Charles said. Abina looked at Leo. She said, "The north wing is ready." She took Leo to a room. The room was larger than any space Leo had ever slept in. There was a bed, there were curtains, there was a small desk, there was a bathroom attached. He stood in the room and he looked at it. Abina said, "There are clothes in the wardrobe. Mr. Harrison's grandson used to stay in this room. You look about the same size." Leo said, "Thank you." She looked at him. She said, "Your hands need cleaning and bandaging." He looked at his hands. "Yes," he said. She cleaned and bandaged his hands in the way of someone who had managed a household that included children and who knew how to do this efficiently and without making it more significant than it needed to be. Leo went to bed. He did not sleep immediately. He lay in the bed with the sheets that were clean in a way he had not experienced since the mission, and he listened to the house. The specific sounds of a large house, settling, distant voices, the sound of rain on the roof. He listened to these sounds and he thought about the construction site and about the plastic sheet and about the specific cold of January nights without walls. He slept. He woke at 5 in the morning because 4 years of construction site sleeping had installed an alarm that went off at first light. He got up. He went downstairs. He went to the kitchen because he was hungry, and because the kitchen was where food lived, and hunger was a simple problem with a simple solution if you were in a house rather than a construction site. Charles was already in the kitchen. He was at the table with coffee and a newspaper. He looked at Leo. "Early riser," he said. "Yes," Leo said. "Sit," Charles said. Leo sat. "What do you eat?" Charles said. "Whatever is available," Leo said. Charles looked at him. He said, "Abina makes a proper breakfast at 7. Until then there is bread in the second cupboard and fruit on the counter." Leo got bread. He ate at the table. Charles read his newspaper. This was the specific quiet of two people who were in the same room and were not performing their presence for each other. Leo ate his bread and Charles read his newspaper, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything. After a while, Charles put down the newspaper. He said, "I want to tell you something." Leo looked at him. He said, "Yesterday I was at that construction site because I had gone to check on a project that is going badly. The site is, there were safety violations I was trying to document. I went alone because I did not want to alert the contractor." He paused. "The section came down faster than I expected." "Yes," Leo said. "If you had not been there," Charles said. "But I was there," Leo said. Charles looked at him. "Yes," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to go to school," he said, "if you are willing." Leo was very still. "I want you to stay here," Charles said, "while you go to school, as long as you want to stay." Leo said, "Why?" Charles said, "Because I was buried in the dark and a child pulled me out with bleeding hands and said nobody should die alone. That is why." Leo looked at him. He thought about the 4 years of the city, about the bag carrying and the car washing and the construction site, about the cold. He said, "Yes, I will go to school." School was different from what Leo had expected. He had not been to school before. The mission had some informal teaching but nothing that matched a proper curriculum. He arrived at the private school that Charles enrolled him in with a gap in his formal education that was significant, and that the school's initial assessment documented with the specific clinical honesty of people who needed to know where to start. He was behind in everything that was taught in classrooms. He was ahead in everything that was learned outside them. His mathematics was weak on paper, but his mental arithmetic, developed through 4 years of calculating market prices and transport costs, and the specific economics of survival, was remarkable. His reading was slow, but his comprehension, when he got through the text, was precise in a way that surprised his teachers. He worked. He worked the way someone works when they understand that the opportunity in front of them is not guaranteed to last, and that wasting it is not an option. He woke early. He did his homework with a thoroughness that made his teachers add feedback they did not usually add to junior student work. He asked questions. He also, in the school environment, encountered class. The school Charles had chosen was the kind of school where the other children came from the kind of families that Charles himself came from. Families where the house had multiple rooms and the car was relatively new, and the school fees were significant but manageable. These children had grown up in a world where Leo had been an invisible person passing through the edges of their awareness. Most of them were fine. Not all. There was a boy named Kweku, 12 years old, broad, with the specific confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation in which his social position was in doubt. He looked at Leo's shoes, the first shoes Leo had owned in years. Purchased by Charles and therefore very clearly not Leo's original shoes. And he made the kind of observation that certain 12-year-olds made about the observable gaps between themselves and others. He said on Leo's second day, in a corridor that had 6 or 7 other students in it, "Your shoes don't match your shirt." Leo looked at him. He said, "I am aware." He said it simply, without aggression and without embarrassment, the specific calm of someone who had a perspective on the relative importance of shoe-shirt coordination that Kweku had not yet developed. Kweku looked at him. He said, "Where did you come from?" Leo said, "I don't see how that's relevant." He walked on. Kweku watched him walk on and did not follow. This was the specific quality Leo had that the school environment, like every other environment he had been in, eventually registered. He was not performing anything. Not toughness, not vulnerability, not social climbing. He simply showed up and did what he was there to do and let the rest arrange itself. He made a friend named Efua. She was 11 small, with round glasses, and the kind of specific enthusiasm for learning that made some children targets, and that in Efua expressed itself as a specific unconscious joy when she understood something. She sat next to Leo in mathematics because they had both been placed in the foundation class, and she had turned to him on the first morning and asked, "Do you understand fractions?" He had said, "Yes, I understand fractions practically, but not how they write them." She had said, "I know how they write them, but not how they work. Let's help each other." They had helped each other. Julian Harrison arrived at the house for the first time 3 weeks after Leo moved in. He was Charles's nephew, the son of Charles's younger brother, who had died 5 years earlier. Julian was 31. He was tall in a way that used height without warmth, the height of someone who understood that physical presence was useful in certain negotiations. He dressed in expensive clothes that were just slightly too new, the way clothes looked when they were chosen to communicate wealth rather than because they were comfortable. He arrived at the house, and he was received into the sitting room by Abina, who told Charles he had a visitor. Charles went to the sitting room. Leo, doing homework in the study adjacent, heard the conversation. Not by intention. The study shared a wall with the sitting room, and the house, like most old houses, had less acoustic isolation than its size suggested. Julian said after the initial greeting, "Who is the child?" Charles said, "His name is Leo, he lives here." A pause. Julian said, "Where did he come from?" Charles said, "He helped me in a situation I found myself in." Another pause. Julian said, "Helped you how?" Charles said, "He saved my life." A longer pause. Julian said, "Uncle, I don't want to be difficult, but taking in street children it's a significant decision. There are proper channels for these things. Children's services, registered guardianship." Charles said, "I am aware of the channels. I am also aware of what a proper guardian is." Julian said, "I'm not questioning your intentions. I'm questioning the practicality." Charles said, "I appreciate your concern, Julian. How was your drive?" The conversation moved to other things. Leo in the study had been still since the moment Julian spoke. He sat with his homework and he thought about the specific quality of Julian's voice when it asked, "Where did he come from?" Not the question itself, the quality of the question. The way it sounded like someone taking inventory of a room and finding an item that should not be there. He thought, that man is going to be a problem. He went back to his homework. He finished the fractions. Something is building inside that house. Stay right here. 6 years passed. Leo was 16 when the specific shape of his life at the Harrison house had become the life he knew rather than the life that had been given to him. The distinction was important. He was not performing gratitude. He was not performing belonging. He had become someone who lived in this house and who went to this school, and who had these relationships in the specific way that things become real through continued presence. He was taller. He had the specific leanness of someone who had spent 4 years in physical outdoor labor, and had then grown into a body that continued to reflect that early conditioning. He was quiet in the way he had always been quiet, not shy, not closed, observant, the quality of someone who had learned early that watching carefully was more useful than reacting quickly. He was also, by this point, genuinely excellent at school. Not in the performed way of someone trying to justify their presence, in the natural way of someone who had found, in formal education, the specific language for ways of thinking he had been doing informally for years. Mathematics had opened up completely in the second year. The formal notation had clicked into place alongside the practical understanding, and the result was a student who his mathematics teacher described in annual reports as one of the clearest mathematical thinkers she had taught. Charles had watched this. He had watched carefully and without saying much about it, which was his way. He had breakfast every morning with Leo. The breakfasts were conversations, not formal, not structured. The kind of conversations that two people had when they had been having breakfast together for 6 years and had covered many topics and were now simply continuing a conversation that had no scheduled end. Charles told Leo about his business. Harrison Holdings was a property development and commercial real estate company. Charles had built it over 40 years, not dramatically, not through a single brilliant idea, but through the specific compound growth of someone who had started with one small property and had understood that the patience to hold things and the ability to see what areas of a city were going to become valuable before they became valuable were the primary skills required. He had grown up in poverty. This was something Charles said once directly in one of the breakfast conversations when Leo was 14. He said, "I want you to know I understand where you came from." Leo said, "You grew up poor." Charles said, "In this city, before Harrison Holdings was anything, before anyone knew my name, my mother sold vegetables in the market and my father drove a taxi. I went to school by running errands for the shopkeepers on my street to pay the fees." Leo looked at him. Charles said, "I am not telling you this so you feel that we are the same. We are not the same. What you went through was harder in ways that I did not experience. I am telling you because I want you to know that I did not always have this." Leo was quiet. He said, "How did you start?" Charles told him. He told him about the first property, a single-room commercial space he had bought at 23 with money he had saved over 5 years of working in another man's real estate office. He told him about the risk of that first purchase, which had seemed enormous at 23. He told him about the 2 years before it generated the return that funded the second purchase. He told him about his wife, Margaret, who had died 12 years ago. He had told Leo about Margaret in small amounts over the years, not as a complete story, but in the way you told people about a person who was still present in everything. In the choice of the house and the garden that was too large for one person, and the specific morning habits that had been established for two, and that continued for one. She had wanted the large house because she wanted a large family. They had tried. The trying had produced grief that they had carried together, and had not had children, and had built the company instead, and had loved each other in the specific way of two people who had gone through difficult things side by side, and who had found that the going through had made the love more real rather than less. She had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning when she was at her desk. Charles had been in a meeting on the other side of the building. He had arrived at the hospital 12 minutes after the call. He had held her hand for 4 hours after she was declared gone, because he was not ready to put it down. Leo had listened to all of this over 6 years of breakfasts. He had listened without performing empathy, with the actual receipt of information about a person who was important and who was no longer there. He had said when Charles told him about Margaret, "I would have liked to meet her." Charles had said, "She would have liked you, she would have had questions." "What kind?" Leo said. "She always asked one question," Charles said. "She asked, 'What is the thing that is most important to you right now?' Not what are you good at? Not what do you want to achieve? What is the most important thing right now? She believed you could understand a person completely from the honest answer to that question. Leo thought about this. He said, "What would I say?" Charles said, "What would you say?" Leo thought. He said, "Right now, I want to understand how the business works, not to have it, to understand it. How a building becomes valuable, how you make decisions about what to keep and what to sell, how you read a city." Charles looked at him. He said, "That is a very good answer." He began teaching him. Julian was at the house more frequently as Charles got older. Not every week. He had his own business interests, his own life, his own reasons for being in Tema or not being in Tema. But he visited. He arrived at the house with the specific frequency of someone who was monitoring something without wanting to appear to monitor it. He and Leo had developed a relationship that was, on the surface, civil. This was Leo's choice. He had decided, at 12 when he overheard the sitting room conversation, that Julian was going to be a feature of this life, and that the approach that would cost him least over time was to be consistently polite without being warm. He greeted Julian when he arrived. He answered questions when they were asked. He did not seek conversation and he did not avoid it. Julian, for his part, had made a different calculation. His calculation was that the child was temporary, that Charles's attachment to Leo was an emotional response to a traumatic event, and that, with the passage of time and the gentle application of appropriate pressure in the right conversations, Charles would understand that the proper thing to do was to maintain a responsible funder-beneficiary relationship with Leo rather than a familial one. He had not made enough progress on this calculation by the time Leo was 16. He was beginning to recalibrate. Leo came home from school one evening, and he went to Charles's study to ask about a business concept he had encountered in a case study. The study had covered a property development decision that Leo had found puzzling and that he wanted Charles's perspective on. This was a standard evening exchange. He knocked on the study door. Charles said, "Come in." Leo came in. Julian was in the study. Both of them looked at him. Julian said, "We were in the middle of something." Leo said, "Sorry, I'll come back." Charles said, "No, Julian, we can continue this later. Come in, Leo." Julian's face did something that was very fast and was, if you were watching for it, not particularly well managed. Leo came in. He asked the question. Charles answered it with the specific engaged attention he brought to Leo's questions about the business. They talked for 20 minutes. Julian sat in the corner chair and contributed nothing. When Leo left, he heard Julian's voice as he pulled the door closed. Julian said, "Uncle, I want to have a direct conversation about the will." Leo did not stop walking. He did not think about the will. He was 16. The will was not something he thought about in connection with himself. He went to his room and he did his homework. At 17, Leo met Nana. Her full name was Nana Ama Yebo. She was also 17. She was at his school in the year below his, not his class, but in his vision consistently, because the school was not so large that you could miss people if you paid attention. He had noticed her because she was the only person in the school library at 6 in the morning when he arrived to do his pre-class reading. She was at a table near the window with a botany textbook and a notebook and a specific quality of absorption in what she was reading that made him walk past her carefully, the way you walked past something focused that you didn't want to disturb. She looked up. She said, "You're here early." "So are you," he said. "I know," she said. "I like the library before the people arrive." "Me too," he said. They went back to their respective reading. This happened 3 mornings before they spoke beyond the initial exchange. On the 4th morning she asked what he was reading. He told her. He asked what she was reading. She told him the botany, which was not a class requirement but a personal project. She was cataloging the medicinal plants that her grandmother grew and had been growing for 50 years, and she wanted to understand them properly. He was interested. Not performatively. He was genuinely interested in the question of why her grandmother had selected those specific plants, which was the kind of question that connected to the way Charles had taught him to think about value. Why had someone made this choice? What did they know that the choice reflected? He asked, "What made your grandmother start the garden?" She said, "My grandfather was sick and the hospital was too far and too expensive. She learned what grew locally that helped. It became a practice." He said, "Did it work?" She said, "It helped. He lived for 30 more years." He looked at her. She said, "My family is from a small town in the Brongahafo region. We don't come from money. I got a scholarship to this school." "I came here because of Charles Harrison," he said. She looked at him. "Harrison Holdings," she said. "He took me in," Leo said. "I was on the street when I was 10. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Does he know about the library mornings?" Leo said, "He knows I come early. He doesn't know about the library specifically." She said, "It is very quiet here in the morning." "Yes," he said. She went back to her botany. They were in the library together 6 mornings, before he realized that he was arriving at the time he arrived, partly because he wanted to. She was the first person he had met since Efua who he talked to without performing anything. She asked questions that went to the actual question. She answered questions the same way. He told Charles about her. Not immediately. 2 months after the library mornings began, when they had moved from library conversation to a shared lunch table, and from shared lunch to the occasional walk through the school grounds after the day ended. Charles said, "Tell me about her." Leo told him. Charles listened. He said, "What is the most important thing to her right now?" Leo recognized the question. He said, "Understanding her grandmother's garden well enough to write it down properly before her grandmother gets too old to explain it." Charles smiled. "Bring her to breakfast," he said. "I would like to meet someone who wakes up early to understand plants." Nana came to breakfast the following Saturday. She and Charles talked for 2 hours. At the end she said to Charles, "Thank you for Leo." Charles looked at her. She said, "I know that might be a strange thing to say, but I mean it directly. He sees things clearly and he doesn't perform anything, and that is because of where he came from and also because of how he has been raised here. So thank you." Charles was quiet for a moment. He said, "He came that way. I mostly just gave him a roof." Leo, at the end of the table, said nothing. But something in his face did something that he could not have stopped if he had tried. "Things are about to get dangerous inside that house. Stay right here." Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub, because what Julian does next is the thing nobody expected. Hit that bell. Charles had a heart condition. This was not new information. He had been managing it for 7 years with medication, with dietary adjustments, with the kind of careful daily management that kept a manageable condition manageable. His cardiologist, Dr. Mensah, who had been managing him for 3 of those 7 years, was specific and consistent. The condition was stable, the medication was working, the requirement was adherence. Leo knew about the condition. He had known for 3 years. Charles had told him when the medication regimen became significant enough that a member of the household should know the specifics. He kept one of the medication bottles in his own room at Charles's request, as a backup to the main supply in Charles's bathroom. He knew what the medication was for and what it looked like and where it was kept. Julian did not know that Leo had the backup supply. This became important. The specific events of the following period assembled themselves over 3 weeks in October of Leo's 18th year. Week 1, Charles's health deteriorated. Not suddenly, in the gradual way of a managed condition that was no longer as well managed as it had been. He was tired. He was short of breath on the stairs. He was less present at breakfasts, not physically. He was there, but less engaged, as if the energy required for conversation was competing with other requirements. Dr. Mensah was called. He adjusted the medication dosage. He said, "He needs rest and complete adherence. Any missed doses at this stage could produce complications." Week 2, Leo noticed something. He could not have said in this week that he had noticed anything specific. It was an accumulation of small things. Julian had been at the house for 4 consecutive days, which was unusual. Abina had the specific expression on her face that she wore when something was wrong in the house, and she was managing it professionally. Charles's morning energy had not improved despite the medication adjustment. He went to Charles's bathroom. He looked at the medication bottles. The level in the primary bottle was higher than it should have been. He counted backwards. The medication was a twice-daily tablet. If Charles had been taking it consistently since the last refill, the bottle should be at a specific level. It was higher, significantly higher, the amount that would be remaining if the medication had been missed for several days. He went to Charles. He said, "Are you taking your medication?" Charles said, "Yes, of course." "Both doses," Leo said. "Yes," Charles said. Leo looked at him. He said, "When did you last take it?" Charles said, "This morning." Leo went back to the bathroom. He looked at the bottle. He smelled the bottle. He was not a pharmacist. He was 18. But he had been in this house for 8 years, and he knew what Charles's medication smelled like, and what he was smelling from this bottle was slightly different. Not significantly, just not entirely right. He went to his room. He took the backup bottle from his drawer. He took 1 tablet from each bottle, and he looked at them side by side. They looked the same. He photographed them. He put Charles's tablet back in the bathroom bottle. He kept 1 from the backup bottle, and he went to school the following morning, and he went directly to the school's chemistry teacher, a woman named Mrs. Asamo, who taught him, and who had told him twice that he had a specific talent for analytical thinking. He said, "I need to ask you something off the record." She looked at him. He said, "Is there a way to tell by looking at a tablet whether it has been tampered with?" She looked at the tablet he put on her desk. She was quiet. She said, "Leo, what is happening?" He told her. She looked at the tablet. She said, "I am going to have this tested. I have a contact at the university. Do you have a second one?" He gave her the second tablet. He went to his classes. He came home. Julian was in the sitting room. Week 3. The university testing took 4 days. In those 4 days, Leo watched. He watched Julian. He watched the specific movements of someone who was waiting for something and whose patience was wearing thin. Julian checked his phone frequently. He was at the house more than he had ever been. He had a conversation in the garden on the phone that Leo did not hear, and that Julian ended when he saw Leo nearby. He watched Charles. Charles was worse, not dramatically, but the cardiologist who was called on day 3 said the medication adjustment was not producing the improvement that should have occurred. He said, "The medication levels in his blood are lower than expected given his reported adherence." The pharmacist's report from the university came on day 4. Mrs. Asamo called him at 2 in the afternoon. She said, "Leo." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The tablet from the bathroom bottle contains a reduced active ingredient, significantly reduced. It looks like the tablet, but it has been reformulated. The active compound is roughly 30% of the standard dose." He was very still. He said, "Someone replaced his medication with a weaker version." She said, "Leo, you need to call the police." He said, "I need to do one thing first." He ran. He ran from school to the house, which was 20 minutes on foot and which he covered in 12. He came through the front door. Abina was in the hall. He said, "Where is Charles?" She said, "His room. Julian is with him." He was already going up the stairs. He went to Charles's room. He opened the door. Julian was at the bedside. Charles was in the bed, his color wrong in the specific way of someone whose heart was not doing what it should be doing. Julian turned. He looked at Leo. His face did the thing of someone who has been caught mid-something and who is calculating the most efficient response. He said, "He's sleeping, you should." "His medication has been replaced," Leo said. He said it directly, no warm-up. Julian said, "What are you talking about?" Leo said, "The tablets in his bathroom bottle have reduced active ingredient. I had them tested. He has been taking approximately 30% of his required dosage for at least a week." Julian looked at him. He said, "That is an extraordinary claim." "I have the university test results," Leo said. He had his phone out. He showed Julian the message from Mrs. Asamo with the attached report. Julian looked at it. His face changed. He said, "Where did you get the comparison tablet?" "My backup supply," Leo said. "Charles asked me to keep one. I kept them in my room." Julian said, "You can't." Leo moved past him to Charles's bedside. He said, "Charles." Charles opened his eyes. Leo said, "I need you to take your real medication. I have it." He had the backup bottle in his pocket. He gave Charles the tablet. He gave him water. Charles took it. He looked at Leo. He looked at Julian. Julian said, "Uncle, this boy is." "Be quiet." "Julian," Charles said. His voice was weak, but the direction was clear. Julian was quiet. Leo said, "I'm calling Dr. Mensah and I'm calling the police." He made both calls. Julian, in the 30 minutes before the police arrived, said several things that did not help his situation. He said that Leo was fabricating the evidence, which Leo knew was not true and which the lab report disproved. He said that Leo had been scheming from the beginning, which was the kind of accusation that people made when they needed to redirect attention. He said that Charles's judgment about Leo had always been distorted by the emotional response to the rescue. Charles listened to all of this from the bed. When Julian had finished, Charles said, "Get out of my house." Julian said, "Uncle." "The police are coming," Charles said. "You can speak to them on your way out." The police came. Dr. Mensah came. Dr. Mensah's assessment was that Charles had been at serious risk, that several more days of the reduced dosage would have produced a cardiac event that, at his age and with his condition, would likely have been fatal. The intervention had been timely. Julian was taken in for questioning. He did not return to the house. The investigation that followed took 6 months and was not something that Leo participated in directly. It was the specific machinery of a legal process that operated without his daily involvement. He gave his statement. He provided the evidence. He went back to school and he went back to the breakfasts and he went back to the evening business conversations. Charles recovered. Not fully, not to where he had been before the incident. The weeks of reduced medication had done some damage that was not reversible, but he was present. He was at the breakfast table. He was asking questions about Leo's school projects. 3 months after the incident, on a Saturday morning, Charles said, "I need to tell you something." Leo looked at him. Charles said, "I have been thinking about what I want to do with what I have built." Leo said, "Charles." "Let me say it," Charles said. He said it. He said he had revised his will. He said he had done this with his lawyer 3 weeks after the incident, when he had had time to sit with what had happened and what it meant. He said he was leaving Harrison Holdings, the full company, to Leo. Leo was quiet for a long time. He said, I don't. You understand the business, Charles said. I have been teaching you for 4 years. You understand it better in some ways than I understood it at your age. You are honest. You are precise. You do not take shortcuts. Leo said, that is not why you are doing this. Charles looked at him. No, Charles said. I am doing this because you are my son, not by blood. By 8 years of breakfasts and homework and a conversation at a well about fractions and a library at 6 in the morning. You are my son and I want to leave what I built to my son. Leo said nothing for a moment. He said, you need to know I am not going to be comfortable with this. Charles said, I know. Leo said, I am going to argue with you about it. Charles said, I know. Leo said, I will probably argue with you about it for a long time. Charles said, I am 72, I have time. Leo looked at him. He did something he had not done since he was 10 years old and had been offered a room in a house, and had looked at the man offering it and had read his face. He read Charles's face. He saw what was there. He said, thank you. Charles nodded. Abina, who was in the kitchen and who had heard all of this because the house had the acoustic characteristics of an old house, and because she had not been making any effort to be quiet, came to the kitchen doorway. She said, breakfast is ready. She went back to the kitchen. They went to breakfast. The last part is coming, the part the whole city watched. Stay right here. The legal process around Julian took 8 months to complete. He had tampered with Charles's medication. The evidence was specific and documented. The motive was the inheritance. His lawyers argued that the reduced medication could have been a pharmaceutical error and that Julian's presence in the house was simply the concern of a nephew for an ill uncle. The pharmaceutical company's analysis of the replacement tablets was not consistent with a manufacturing error. The specific chemical reduction in the active compound was too precise to be accidental. Julian received a custodial sentence of 4 years. Charles did not attend the sentencing. He had given his victim impact statement in writing, and he had asked Leo whether he wanted to attend, and Leo had said no. He had said, I know what happened. I don't need to watch the outcome to understand it. Charles had looked at him. He had said, that is a very mature position for someone who is 18. Leo had said, I had a good teacher. Leo finished school the month after Julian's sentencing. His results were, by any objective measure, exceptional. His mathematics and his business studies were both top of the year. He had also, in his final year, produced a project that his economics teacher had submitted to a regional academic competition, which it had won. The project was an analysis of urban property value patterns in Tema over 20 years. He had used Harrison Holdings' portfolio as a case study and had produced work that his teacher described as publishable. He enrolled in a business and economics degree at the University of Ghana, Legon. Charles drove him to the campus on the first day. He brought him to his room in the student housing. He looked at the room. He said, it's small. Leo said, it's a room I've had smaller. Charles was quiet. He said, I know. He left. Leo unpacked. He called Nana. She was at a university in Kumasi. She had been accepted to study biological sciences, which was the natural continuation of the botanical interest she had been developing since the library mornings. They had been in different cities for 6 weeks by this point, which was the specific new difficulty of a relationship that had been built in proximity and was now being managed across distance. She said, how is the room? He said, Charles thinks it's small. She said, is it? He said, I've had smaller. She said, I know, that's why it's fine. He sat on the bed in the room that was smaller than his room at the Harrison house, and he looked at the window, and he thought about the construction site and the plastic sheet, and the 50-meter walk in January cold that had produced the sound under the boards. He thought here. He thought from there to here. Not with gratitude exactly, with the specific clear-eyed appreciation of someone who understood the distance they had traveled and the specific combination of factors that had produced the travel. Luck, which was the construction site being that construction site and Charles being the specific person who was there. Choice, which was moving toward the sound rather than away from it. Character, which was carrying the grain sacks all the way to the end and saying nobody should die alone. All three, not just one. The announcement happened when Leo was 24. He had completed his degree. He had spent 2 years after his degree working inside Harrison Holdings, not at the top, at the operational level, learning the company from inside the way Charles had learned it from inside a different company 40 years earlier. He had been in the property assessment teams. He had been in the negotiation rooms. He had been in the community consultation meetings that Charles had always insisted on running before a development was finalized. Charles had watched him. Not every day. Charles was 76 and his health was managed carefully, and he was not at the office every day. But he watched through the reports and through the evening calls and through the Saturday breakfasts that continued. At 24, Leo came to a Saturday breakfast. Charles was at the table. He had an envelope. He said, "Sit." Leo sat. Charles said, "I want to make this formal." He pushed the envelope across. Leo opened it. It was a letter from the Harrison Holdings board, signed by all 7 board members, formally recognizing Leo Adolfo as the designated successor to Charles Harrison in the role of chairman and chief executive. Leo read it. He looked at Charles. He said, "You talked to the board." Charles said, "I have been talking to the board for 6 months. I wanted them to have time to form their own view of you without me being in the room. I gave them access to everything you have done since you joined the company." Leo said, "What was their view?" Charles said, "Unanimous." Leo was quiet. He said, "I need to tell you something." Charles waited. Leo said, "I have been planning something for 3 years, before I could be sure of the succession, before I knew what I was going to have access to. I have been planning what I am going to do with it." Charles said, "Tell me." Leo told him. He described a project he called the Osai Street Initiative, named for the street where the mission had been, the mission that had been his first home and that had been closed by a funding gap when he was 6. The project was not the mission specifically. It was broader. It was a property development initiative that would create housing and educational infrastructure in the commercial shadow areas of Tema, the specific areas where children like Leo existed in the city's working edges without access to what the city center had. He had spent 3 years developing the financial model. He put it on the table. Charles picked it up. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "This is why you wanted to understand the business." Leo said, "Yes." Charles said, "Not to run the company." Leo said, "To be able to do this with the company, or alongside it, or something." Charles said, "When you were 14 and I asked you what was most important to you, you said you wanted to understand how the business worked." "Yes," Leo said. "This," Charles said. He looked at the initiative document. "This is what the understanding was for." Leo said, "Yes." Charles put the document down. He looked at Leo. He said, "The ghost boy." Leo said, "I was never a ghost. I just didn't have walls yet." Charles was quiet. He said, "When do you want to start?" The formal announcement of Leo's succession was made at the Harrison Holdings annual stakeholder event. 400 people. Charles stood on the stage. He said, 14 years ago I was trapped under debris on a construction site that I should not have been on alone. A boy with bleeding hands who had no shoes and no home pulled me out and said, Nobody should die alone. I brought him home. I gave him breakfast and a school. He gave me, and I want to be specific about this, he gave me back what I had been losing slowly since my wife died, which was the sense that what I was building was for something. He looked at Leo in the front row. He said, I am naming Leo Adolfo as the next chairman of Harrison Holdings, not because he saved me, though he did, because he is the most complete person I have had the privilege of spending time with, and the company will be better with him in this role than it was with me. The room. The room did what rooms did when something true and significant was said in front of enough people. It was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. The Osai Street initiative launched 18 months later. The first building was a residential and educational complex on the edge of the commercial district. 24 family apartments above a ground-floor learning center that had a library, a vocational skills workshop, and a basic health consultation space. The library was open at 6 in the morning. The day of the opening, Leo walked through the building. He went to the library. He stood in it. Nana was beside him. They had married the year before, not in a large ceremony, not the kind of event that the announcement of a Harrison Holdings succession might have been expected to produce. In Kumasi, at her grandmother's house, with the grandmother's garden visible through the window, and with the specific warmth of a celebration that was about the people in it rather than the occasion. She stood beside him in the library. She said, "Does it look like you imagined?" He said, "Better." She said, "Your grandmother would have." She stopped herself. He looked at her. She said, "Sorry, I don't know why I said that." He said, "It's okay." He looked at the window. Through the window, the street was visible, the specific street where he had not been a ghost but had been invisible, where people had walked past him the way they walked past the other furniture of the city's working edges. The street looked the same. The building was new. He thought one building. He thought 24 families. He thought one library that opens at 6 in the morning for whoever needs it. He thought about the construction site and the boards and the bleeding hands and the specific logic of moving toward a sound rather than away from it, because the sound was a person and people mattered. He thought that is all it was. He went outside. There was a girl on the street. She was about 10. She had the specific look of a child who had the city in her eyes, who had been in it long enough to have learned it rather than been protected from it. She was looking at the building. She said, "Is this open?" He said, "Yes." She said, "There is a library." He said, "Yes, it opens at 6 in the morning." She said, "I'm usually up at 5. He said, "Then you can come at 5:30. The library will be ready." She looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "My name is Leo. I used to sleep near here." She looked at him. She looked at the building. She said, "Now you have a house." He said, "Now I have a lot of houses. Come in. I will show you where the books are." She came in. He showed her where the books were. Leo Adolfo went from a construction site to a boardroom. But this is not a story about that journey. That journey is the frame. The story is about what was inside the frame, the specific decisions that a person made when they had nothing and when they had everything. When he had nothing, he moved toward a sound in the dark. He did not calculate. He did not assess whether helping was going to cost him something. He heard a sound that was a person and he went to it, and he used the metal pipe in his bleeding hands and he pulled. When he had everything, when he was sitting in a boardroom with a document saying he was the next chairman of a significant company, the first thing he put on the table was the Osai Street initiative, the thing he had been planning for 3 years, the thing that was not for himself. There is a line in this story that Charles Harrison said at the stakeholder event. He said, "He gave me back what I had been losing slowly, the sense that what I was building was for something. This is the line. Every person who builds something, every person who works hard and accumulates and grows and manages and produces, at some point you have to know what you are building it for, what the thing is in service of, what the answer is when someone asks, the way Margaret Harrison used to ask, what is the most important thing right now? Leo's answer was always the same. At 14 it was, understand how the business works. At 20 it was, build the thing that fills the gap. At 24 it was, the Osai Street Library at 6 in the morning for the girl who is up at 5. The answer changed form, the direction was consistent. He was moving toward the sound. He always had been. That is the story. If you are watching this and you are trying to build something, if you are in the part of the story where the construction site is still the construction site, and the plastic sheet is still the only roof, hear this. The most important thing is the direction you are moving in. Not where you are right now, not even where you are going, the direction. Are you moving toward the sounds in the dark? Are you using the metal pipe you have with the hands you have? That is the whole question. The rest follows. This has been Tribal Tales Hub. If this story did something for you, if the construction site or the library at 6 in the morning, or the girl asking, who are you, landed the way we hoped it would, like this video, that is how you tell us to keep making these. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. Every week we bring you a story that has something real in it, not just entertainment, something worth thinking about when the video is over. Hit that bell. Be there every time. Comment below, tell us what sound have you been moving toward, what is the thing you are building and what is it for? Tell us. We read everything. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the direction matters more than the current position, with someone who is sleeping under a plastic sheet of their own and who needs to know that the distance between there and somewhere different is not as fixed as it feels. This has been Tribal Tales Hub. We will see you in the next story.